Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Digital Banter. If you've joined us up to this point for season 3, you've come along the journey with us on our 6-part series for ad campaign planning and strategy. Today, we've hit stage 5, and we're going to be talking about creating impactful messaging and developing clear and persuasive ad copy. Now, today's topic, in a big picture view of things, is not about telling you how to position your business, but we're going to give you some simple guidelines as it relates to your paid media copy, creative, and how you position ads when you're writing, hopefully, compelling, persuasive copy. Now, go ahead, James.
I was to say one thing to add, this is definitely heavily a positioning conversation. You said, we're not going to go there are way better experts out there for actual product positioning within a market, but we are going to teach you how to take that positioning that you have invested in heavily and apply it to ad copy in a very meaningful way.
Or looking at the positioning that may be highly generic and broad and whittling it down to something that is more appropriate for the distribution channel and the audience that you have hopefully curated and researched up to this point. Hint, hint, listen to past episodes of the series if you haven't.
We might go into that here in a second, right?
Yeah, because I think the thing that sets the stage here for how to create compelling, persuasive copy is understanding where you're coming from and why your ads may not be resonating, or in simple terms, why your ads may suck today. So, James, I think combined, we've seen a lot over our, 15 years in digital marketing and especially paid media.
Maybe seen it all.
I don't know about seeing it all, but I think there's some commonalities here that allude to and kind of set the stage for why some ads underperform. So do you want to take that as a kickoff?
Sure. I don't know if I want to go through this whole list. I'll save you some of these. But I think the biggest thing that I see, and we talked about this in our last episode, the great thing about advertising is that you can speak to a very specific audience. A lot of times when you're developing your overall positioning, there are segments of that do speak in generalities, and you can't do that in ads. Your message needs to be clear. You need to say what you're doing, who you're doing it for, and what the problem is. And that's what the great thing about paid media in comparison to any sort of organic traffic or any organic content is you can be 100% positive that you're getting in front of the right people for the most part. And when you can do that, speaking in generalities is there's no point to it, right? You don't need to say, if you want to speak with somebody, I'll say the LinkedIn sphere has had a couple of posts, enterprise, and the enterprise buyer you have to speak to differently. I think my opinion are people, and you're going to talk to people in the same way based on what their problems are. But if you do have different problems at an enterprise level than you do at SMB level, you can segment that market and speak to them differently. It's awesome. So that's probably the number one thing that I see. And then Andy, I'm going to steal your first one before I hand the rest of them to you. Because this is one that is just absolutely shocking to me. Sometimes there's a huge disconnect of understanding the product and what you sell. And I think that in B2B, we see this a lot because products are very complex. These are a product that's built by an engineer, and you have people built by an engineer for an engineer, and you have people on the marketing team who have zero engineering experience. So they're trying to take very technical stuff and boil it up into something that is more layman's terms when it comes to messaging. And they often miss the mark because they boil it up too high and nobody knows what it actually says.
And to build off of that, then, it's the differentiators are unclear because it's typically being dictated by somebody earlier in the process, we'll say. So product, great example there. And the other aspect of that is clear differentiation or lack thereof. Let's face it, you may have the same feature set as your closest competitor, but you can't be going to market saying the same thing as them. You have to find something that differentiates, even if it's not actually true. I don't want to say actually true, but say it in a way that will resonate with the audience you're going after, and make it clear that, look, beyond the surface, there probably is a differentiator. You just need to try and hone in and find what's going to resonate with that audience better than your competitor will. And
On
to
that
go with
one,
that, yeah, I was going to say, just on top of that, right? That goes hand in hand with like identifying clear, tangible benefits for the audience you're trying to market and sell to, that is going to resonate with them beyond just cost savings, time savings, things like that.
I think that's the piece like a lot of marketers miss, because when they are boiling things up to, like, I don't know, basically surface level messaging, like, it does come off as you're exactly the same as your competitors. And I can't tell you how many clients we've worked with historically where when we started working with them, I mean, it kind of felt to me like you have an inferior product that is more expensive and a contract length that is less flexible. And it's just like, well, this doesn't seem like a marketing problem the way that we're pushing it. So like you have to dive deeper. And then, normally you find out like, oh, well, the reason they use this product is because it's required for a lot of like government contracts or something very specific along those lines, which is a differentiator, but they're looking at the product apples to apples and not necessarily like the use case or, a specific integration you may have, like our product is built on Snowflake. I think that I don't remember what client that was, but it was the reason that they were different is because they were built specifically for Snowflake, right? And that's a differentiator that was not clear in any of the messaging. I mean, knowing that alone, that changed everything for us. Like, you can then target people who use Snowflake. You can use that in your messaging, makes you 10 times more relevant to then saying your usual rant, like, oh, we can save time and money with this tool that does the exact same thing as your competitor.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I don't want to go completely down a rabbit hole here, but for example, let's say you sell AP automation software. Okay, well, everybody under the sun that does that and offers that is probably saving the cost of invoice processing and hopefully getting payments out the door faster, and therefore, having a much better understanding of cash flow, financial operations, things like that. But if that's the general message, right, how does that differ when you look at it from a vertical perspective? Automotive is going to have a very different challenge and outcome and purpose for AP automation software than, let's say, a manufacturing company where they're paying or having to work through net 90, net 180 terms, things like that in both receivables and payments. Very different challenges, but that comes back to the audience then and how you message it accordingly, even if it's the same feature set.
So, I mean, I'll tag onto that. The great thing about paid media versus organic SEO content, like, you can speak to those very specific audiences and be very confident that that's the audience that you're speaking to. Even if like you create a content piece and call it basic SEO blog post. I know that's not really a thing anymore, but it's something that's tailored towards a specific industry. You still cannot control the traffic that is going to that page. Where on the paid side, you can say that only people in the automotive industry in this job title, in this role, with this seniority at these companies are the people that we're talking to, which, think about how much more specific you can be.
And the other thing, before we kind of talk about how do we solve for these types of things, is at a technical level, character constraints, particularly when you think about search ads. You're not going to actively be able to address the differentiators and value propositions to a unique audience in search. Search is meant for a very specific purpose that is lower in the funnel, intent laden and intent driven. And when we think about copy and creative and audience segments, we need to think about all of the media channels that we're putting into market, particularly when you think about, let's say, video or paid social or things like that. And that's one of the main reasons why we haven't even talked about the media plan yet within this 6-part series, because we have to do all this foundational work first, and then we get to the media plan. So anyway, those are many reasons why we see ads underperform. So James, what makes a good ad?
All right, so we went over this last week, but I think it's really important to reiterate. We need clear and concise messaging. don't be vague. You're not talking to investors. You're talking to people who are actually going to buy your product. Speak to a specific audience. I think I just nailed that for 5 minutes straight. I'm not going to go into that again. Diverse formats designed specifically for the channel. We went into detail on that last week. And then the last piece is really just a strong, compelling hook. I mean, that's kind of can be the case across any channel. I mean, YouTube, we always talk about like the first 6 seconds and how much they matter because it's skippable, but that is the case for any ad that you write. It needs to be kind of compelling right off the bat. I mean, that's just creativity right there. There's a million different ways to do that.
Create a reason to consume the ad.
Pretty much. I mean, it has to stand out, right?
Yep.
So I guess the other thing, so that's really just more around like messaging format. Honestly, I feel like that's the basics. So then last week, we also went into pretty far in detail our advertising content pillars, right? So when you have a content strategy, everybody has like their content pillars, right? We talk about this topic, this topic, this topic, and you can still have those like, and that all that stuff is going to be relatable to ads, but we really break down paid media content pillars into 4 buckets, and that's content around pain points, content about product education, content is social proof, and then handling common objections before they come up. The thing that we really didn't get into is like kind of examples of like what that content looks like and some like the right way to frame content in each of those. And that's what we'll get into here today.
Yeah, because when we think about looking beyond just those buckets, how do we create messaging that ultimately stands out? And there's really 2 areas of focus that come into play with that. It's creating a strategic point of view and really leaning into and understanding the key differentiators that are going to matter to your audience. So James, why don't you kind of dive deep into those a little bit?
Yeah. So I kind of think of these as actually separate. I mean, certainly they can be layered in on top of each other. You can mix it in this, like any framework, you can bend it however way you need to, right? But your strategic point of view, like this is more from like a brand perspective, right? Like as a brand, there are things that you can do to stand out that are kind of outside of like what your product and service is. I mean, even though they're a competitor of ours, I'll give like Chris Walker a lot of credit for this, right? Like at the end of the day, like they're not creating a new industry, they're not creating a new service line, but people look and follow their brand because he has a very distinct point of view around attribution and generally at this point, like how a SaaS business should be run, right? And that's the reason that people look at him at the thought leader level as like, that's a big thing that drives their brand. When it comes to, I mean, differentiators, this is more around like what is actually making your product different and making sure that that aligns to essentially all of the audience research stuff that we did ahead of time, right? I think one of the things as we kind of dig in pretty deep here into the 4 different layers of content is like all of this, everything that you're creating needs to be based in audience research and what the customer actually cares about. Like, what are the differentiators that the customer actually cares about? What is the point of view that is different than what is already like you need to be, your point of view needs to be different than something that they've heard before, right? Like that's a huge thing when you're creating a strategic point of view. It needs to be unique. And your differentiators like need to be what they actually care about. So those are the 2 things. And like I said, we'll get into those in pretty detail as we talk about each of the content types.
The other thing to point out with uniqueness is how it's conveyed. So from the perspective of, think about a competitive market where a lot of the strategic points of view are conveyed through, I don't know, analyst reports, ebooks, the written word, so to speak. And you have an opportunity to break through the noise by possibly having the same narrative to an extent and point of view, but providing it in a different format that is consumed in a different way than the rest of the competitive set. I think that also allows you to position yourself as a thought leader as a brand leader, but also strengthen that point of view because you're delivering it in a different way than the rest of the market. So let's talk about kind of those two key points of differentiation and points of view within our 4 content buckets. Let's kick that off with pain points, James.
All right. So I've mentioned this before that pain point content. So I differentiate pain point content and product education. A lot of times these do overlap, right? You'll see like when we get into the product education, it's very pain point focused. But when I talk about pain point content, I am talking about content that adds value before offering the product, right? So example one, it kind of goes right into what I talked about before around your strategic point of view. So your goal here is to position your brand as a thought leader on a specific product, and you want your strategic point of view to address pain points of that audience. But what you're doing here is you're offering a perspective or angle that is not necessarily the same. Like it needs to be different than everybody else. I mean, one of the things that I kind of lay into here quite often is like, what proprietary information do you have as a company? If you're a SaaS product, a lot of SaaS products, they collect data. Like, what does your data tell you that gives you a unique, different view on the market? I gave the example of Hockey Stack last week. They're a marketing attribution software. Everybody uploads their data in there and they use it for reporting. So Hockey Stack has access to industry benchmarks that are specific to B2B software. They know the series of the company, like they know their clients really well. So they're able to offer a unique, different point of view that maybe not somebody else doesn't have because they actually have the data to support it. And I think some of the stuff that I was talking about with Refine Labs before too, like they have a unique, different perspective based on how they collect data, not using attribution software. I mean, I'm making it a little cut and dry. I know that their business does use attribution software. I don't want to get called out by anybody. But like their point of view on that is a lot different than what Hockey Stacks would be, right? And that's actually great because you have 2 different perspectives. There's a reason for an audience to follow 2 different people, 2 different companies, and they get, they're getting unique insights from both angles.
It's a good thing that I just thought of. So going off of that and going back to what I was saying about it's a matter of like how you present it in the format and things like that. I think too many times we've seen some of this internal proprietary data boil up in the form of maybe a case study or some level of content that's touting yourself rather than the impact and outcome. So an easy win here potentially is if you have that set of data. I'll go back to the AP software example I gave before. Instead of positioning it as, look what these customers were able to do by using our software, rather using it in the sense of when you transition your company over to an AP solution, maybe such as ours or just in generalities, the impact is XYZ. And this is backed up by 600 companies that we've been able to benchmark, gather data on, etc. And then your follow-up out of that is the soft sell into, hey, do you want to basically do the same thing? Demo our product. It's a matter of how you position it. And that's kind of what, I feel like we're really harping on today's episode around.
So I think a big thing with this is like, in this situation, you are presenting educational content as the solution to the problem. At this stage in the funnel, you're not presenting your product as the solution to the problem. You are creating educational content with the data you have. You're inserting your strategic point of view and your narrative into that. So like, say I'm Hockey Stack, for example, it's like I'm inserting the narrative that like there's a lot of really cool stuff that you can do with attribution tech, and we just happen to be an attribution tech provider. But you're also, in the content you're providing, you're giving them value and solutions to their problems. Like people understand like, oh, how are other businesses like me trending? How what is the benchmark for this metric? What's the benchmark for that metric? So you're helping somebody solve problems that they have. without necessarily giving them the solution just yet.
But that actionable advice and solution, even if it's soft and like, somewhat broad, I feel like is the value add that makes that consumption of content important, because otherwise you're left wondering, so what? Great. I read these benchmarks. Great. I read this research. I got all, understood about dynamic discounting, things like that. But so what? Right. And this goes back then into the other pillars, right? It talks about product education as a gateway there.
Yeah. I mean, like at this stage of the funnel, your main goal is bringing somebody from unaware to aware, which
Correct.
is also the hardest part of, we've said this before, the hardest part of this whole funnel. Now is your attribution going, we're just talking about attribution. Is your attribution going to be super awesome for this? No, you're focused on engagement and creating content that people actually care about. I mean, the goal and the strategy behind this stage of the funnel is actually pretty in line with some of the similar goals that you'll have from your organic social strategy, your SEO strategy, your content strategy. Like you're trying to bring people from unaware to aware, and then we start to try to convert them later on. Again, the great thing about this is you can build an audience based on all the people who actually engaged with the content and thought it was good, and you can bring them along with you.
Side note, episode 1 of the series also broke down KPIs and metrics of success based off of all of this information. But that aside, when we shift our focus towards the product education bucket of content, I really like the way you kind of framed this for problem agitation. James, talk to me about that.
Yeah. So product education, right? We still want to pull on the emotional strings, right? And this really is like a 3-step process framework that you can follow to write good ads that are product related content, right? So you want to first identify the problem that they have. You want to agitate that problem by highlighting specific pain points. And then you want to provide your product as the solution. And like, there are a ton of different ways to actually do this, but like the main goal is that you do want to, highlight something that's very difficult for them to do right now. I've given the example before. Most software products are replacing a spreadsheet. Like, oh, this takes you a long time and it's frustrating. Then you kind of agitate that problem, hit on the pain points. Like, this is taking away from other stuff that you're doing. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you can agitate it, but it's kind of like, give them one thing that stings a little bit, like, fuck, that thing, that sucks.
So what you're saying is every good ad should piss you off.
I mean, there are 2 different ways to go about it, right? I think that like, I mean, you can have an approach that is certainly more inspiring. But I think it's just like one of those things that in most B2B SaaS scenarios, like you are solving for a problem that's kind of like annoying within your business.
You got a good line there, whether you realize it or not. It's problem identification and then agitate and inspire the solution to the problem.
Right.
There you go.
But some of the stuff that I really like right now is the like, watch how I do this in 30 seconds or less. Watch how it's just like, you are showing, it's great because you are showing the product. You are showing how easy the product is to use, and you're showing how it solves a problem that takes a lot longer than 30 seconds. And I think it's just like a great way to go about it.
Now, as we think about that moving towards and forward in the buyer journey, we then start to think about, okay, well, again, to your point before, somebody's gone from unaware to aware. And now as they enter that decision-making process, there is a level of social proof that comes into play of justification and transitioning from emotional to logic-based decision-making.
Yeah, I think the main thing here is that you need to ensure that social proof is directly related to the pain points and objections that you're getting. So it's like I said, these tend to overlap. I mean, one of the biggest problems that I see is like, there's a lot of like great testimonial mashups. There's a lot of great like everybody's doing like the screenshot of a review now, and like all that stuff is great social proof. But I've also seen a lot of stuff that's just like, I love these guys, or their customer service is great, or they're not speaking to a specific, like, they're going back to the two things that we talked about before. They're not talking about the differentiation, and they're not talking about their strategic point of view and kind of how that helped them. I think the differentiation piece is like a great thing here. Like if somebody was like, oh man, I was working with Salesforce for forever and it just got too clunky and it was so difficult to train our team. But when we moved over to HubSpot, it was so easy to use and everybody loves it so much more because of these integrations that are no longer a problem for us. Like that's a much more compelling argument than some of the very basic, like, I don't know, you get a lot of testimonials that don't really say anything.
No, I mean, and there's nothing that backs it up necessarily. Like, for example, I got handed a campaign a couple of months ago where the core messaging is basically like, oh, we're trusted by 25,000 customers. Well, whoop-de-doo. Scale doesn't matter at the end of the day. Are you trusted by 25,000, I don't know, AP managers because of XYZ product that you're offering within this offering or not? And I forget maybe you have it in here, but one of your quotes always sticks with me is like, just because you say it doesn't make it true. Like, back it up, right? And that's where this social proof comes into play. Great, you won a G2 fall leader award. Well, back it up. What does that actually mean? And using that social proof to then jump that off into the other logic-based decision-making process here and other content bucket of common objections.
Oh boy. So this one, there's a lot of different ways to go about it. Some of the stuff I don't think I'm going to go through in its entirety, but so common objections, like you're trying to get ahead of stuff before it actually comes up. What people want, I'm going to steal this from Jared Fuller. Like, people want to see that people who are in a similar role to them have had success in a very specific scenario. So like, instead of, there are certain things like being transparent and honest and like offering free trials and demos and stuff like that certainly helps with like objections because you're removing the barrier to entry. But I think the main thing here is having some level of storytelling that's layered in there, right? So going back to those testimonials, like, how did you solve a specific problem for a specific person? So like, when X company first approached us, they were concerned with long contracts. After a year of flexibility and growth, now they're one of our biggest advocates. So like, you can take examples like that, and where you're saying, when this person first came to us, they had this problem, and this is how we solved this problem with our differentiating item. And that's like just a good way to approach storytelling for any sort of common objection that comes through. I mean, the other thing is just like knowing what the actual common objections are. Like I talked about this on task, like pricing is always one, integrations is always one, not understanding, like being afraid that they're not going to use the software is another one, or kind of the fear of change is another one. So those are a lot of things like you can get over the fear of change by offering like free trials and demos and training and like lots of like resources on your website. A lot of companies do like money back guarantees. Like if you don't use it in X, whatever, like it's kind of the same thing as a free trial, honestly. Transparent pricing. Like, I mean, every B2B influencer on the planet has said something about this at this point, but yeah, like put at least like a starting at price so people know. Like, nobody wants to submit a lead for something and then find out that it's 10 times what their actual budget was. Like, you got to have at least some level of alignment there. Competitive analysis, I also consider in the common objections bucket. Like, this is something that is definitely going to happen at the bottom of the funnel. I mean, I guess one of the biggest problems that we see here, you get all the competitive landing pages, right? A lot of people doing competitive branded search. There's a lot of different ways to go, but there's always a landing page that says, this is us. this is our competitor 1, competitor 2, competitor 3, and let's do these super bias check boxes that show that we have all the features that they don't. People read right through that. Again, going back to being some level of honest acknowledgement, like say that like, they have this and they're better fit for this market and we're a better fit for that market. Save yourself a big hassle. Everybody's afraid to say that like something about their company that isn't necessarily good, but the more transparent you can be about that, the better.
The more human you are at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I think
pretty much
the other thing that came to mind when you were going through that is how do you possibly get that off the ground with some of those objections? 9 times out of 10, you have probably an FAQ page. And if you don't, you should, that are already addressing those objections. It's taking those generic FAQs and creating the story narrative that aligns with those and aligns with the audience. I mean, you mentioned yourself with like HubSpot, right? An FAQ would probably be, okay, well, what do you integrate? How much do you cost? Okay. Then on top of that, what is the impact of that, which you're not going to get from that FAQ, but you're going to get from the story that builds on top of that and the core function of that FAQ itself. Like it's not necessarily, and I don't want to be facetious here, but it's like, it feels like it's not that big of a lift. It's just identifying the opportunity and being creative to take the lift to the next level.
Another thing that I like that I have seen brands too is like, what is the most common reason somebody makes the jump from this software to this software? So like, why does I gave the example a little bit backwards because I prefer HubSpot over Salesforce because, enterprise equals clunky. But like, what is the reason that somebody moves from HubSpot to Salesforce? Like, what is the trigger behind that? At this point, it's like not nearly what it once was, but like, there are additional, like we made this decision because we were trying to do a specific task that this one tool like wouldn't let us do. Like that's usually what it is. Like say that, right? And then you can speak to those specific people because, it's just like when you're giving a presentation and nobody wants to ask questions and you're like, well, please ask questions because if you don't ask, there's 10 other people with the same question, right? It's the same thing here where you can say the reason that people switch because there's probably 50 other companies out there who are going through the exact same thing and they don't understand necessarily like, oh well, if they switched because of this, maybe we should switch because of that.
Yeah. Now the thing that might get lost here as we kind of walked through those 4 content buckets is at the end of the day, you still need to have a level of brand consistency in tone, in message, in alignment across your various audiences and campaigns, because there's 2 main outputs of that. It adds clarity, number 1, about what you do and who you do it for, and it creates the brand recall that creates the motion of turning somebody from unaware to aware over the course of time and ultimately breeds into long-term customer growth and LTV.
I think with this one, like people do get carried away with like ad testing and A/B testing and things like that. And you do have to have a certain adherence to a brand guideline. I mean, your strategic point of view should be kind of layered into everything that you do. And that's like a brand guideline to an extent from a copywriting perspective. I mean, most established companies have brand books with tone, whatever, but to be honest, I feel like sometimes that stuff's bullshit. It's like, oh, like we're personable and we're cool and we're this and we're that. But like the real thing is like, hey, we need our strategic point of view layered into everything that we write. And then visually, this is a whole other rabbit hole. I can't tell you how many brands we've worked with where like A/B testing has just gotten out of control with like, brand color number 4 turning into the primary brand color. And it just like, if you look at 10 of our ads, it looks like 10 different companies. Yes, like sometimes you do have to weigh out the orange ad is performing better, but 90% of our ads are in green and black. Like you should probably take the orange ones, make it green and black instead of trying to then switch everything over to orange. Because consistency is important there.
One thing I'm going to argue with you on lightly is consistency in the adherence to brand guidelines, in the respect that those brand guidelines need to be living and breathing and constantly changing based off of the market, the competition, and how the audiences that you're going after react to your message and your brand. For example, something that's very tech heavy, let's say data center esque. 9 times out of 10, you got to position things a little bit differently to break out than just having like a server rack as the main core piece of imagery and guidelines that say, oh, we need to say this exact product name and this down here and that and that and that. Like, you don't break through the noise by just going through the motions in the status quo. You do have to break out of that and test different things in a consistent manner.
Maybe we should do another brand session, because that's a problem with the brand itself, right? Like, if you put too many handcuffs on it, it definitely is a problem.
Yeah, you kill the brand. Then you kill the brand by doing that.
Yeah, but you should be able to look at an ad and say, oh, that's a HubSpot ad, or oh, that's a Salesforce ad, and not necessarily just from their logo.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. So we covered a lot today when we talked about positioning and messaging and some layers of ad copy that came into play there. But more importantly, we've gotten to the point now of our series and process where we can actually get to getting something live and starting to learn and test and scale it, because all of the upfront work has been done. It's gotten us to the point of creating a media plan. And now it's time to actually put it into motion and confirm that what we researched, what we put together works, and identify the strengths and weaknesses and scale the shit out of it to maximize revenue. Anything else you want to add on to today's episode, James?
$1 billion.
And on that note, we will catch you next week for that episode. And in the meantime, like, subscribe, and check out dragon360.com. We'll catch you guys later. See ya.